In one of my recent videos, I proposed a theory that Mesmer impaled his mother Marika, which earned him his title of the Impaler. It got me more interested in the pose we see Marika commonly depicted in. A pose that is very reminiscent of Jesus affixed to the cross and pierced by a spear wielded by the Roman soldier Longinus. Not only is it another indicator for my theory about Mesmer's title having more validity, but Marika being featured prominently in the same pose as Jesus does hold different symbolic meanings. I have researched 4 different symbolic meanings behind someone being depicted in a cross pose, which are all represented in Elden Ring's lore. The first symbolism originates from Christianity, which I'm sure isn't a surprise to you. After all, it remains one of the oldest and largest religions in the world to this day. Given its prominence, you are likely familiar with the stories about Jesus Christ, including his crucifixion and resurrection 3 days later. Yet, much like me initially, you may not be familiar with the profound symbolism behind the act of dying on the cross. For specifically in Christianity, it is not only a symbol of sacrifice, redemption, and salvation. However, a character adopting such a pose can also symbolize piety, an act of reverence towards God, or a devout fulfillment of religious obligations. In other words, proving one's faith in a power greater than oneself. While the cross also symbolizes a willingness to endure suffering for a greater cause. The last 2 symbolic meanings, piety and willingly suffering, are attributes that undeniably represent Marika. For the fulfillment of a religious obligation is an aspect she is forced to carry out, by acting as the vessel for the Elden Ring even after shattering it. But the willingness to endure suffering for a greater cause can also be attributed to her awaiting a Tarnished, who is capable of killing the Elden Beast and as a result become the next Elden Lord. A cause she has plotted since divesting Godfrey of his grace. As such, by shattering the Elden Ring, Marika being punished for it by the Greater Will, and also by bestowing grace back onto the Tarnished, her cross-like pose depiction embodies these symbolic meanings. And at the same time, this might also symbolize Marika offering protection to the Tarnished. For in many Christian traditions, making the sign of the cross is a widespread gesture to seek divine protection or blessings. A character striking a cross pose might be seeking divine assistance, expressing gratitude, or warding off evil, as it is stated by Bert Getzi in his book The Sign of the Cross, Our Badge of Faith. We cannot be certain as to precisely when Marika was depicted in the cross pose in her statues, but since we can see her in that pose in this frame of Elden Ring's opening, it is my assumption that it must have begun around the time the Tarnished were stripped of their grace. For the symbolic meaning behind her cross pose might not only be related to wishing the Tarnished a safe journey outside of the lands between, because it could also mean that death isn't the end for them, as she explicitly states to Godfrey and his kin.
My lord, and thy warriors, I divest each of thee of thy grace. With thine eyes dimmed, ye will be driven from the lands between. Ye will wage war in a land afar, where ye will live and die. Then, after thy death, I will give back what I once claimed. Return to the lands between, wage war, and brandish the Elden Ring. Grow strong in the face of death, warriors of my lord, Lord Godfrey.
Even if a Tarnished fell in battle striving to grow stronger for Marika, they would eventually be resurrected. This is because Marika required powerful warriors capable of navigating the turmoil unleashed by the shattering of the Elden Ring and the subsequent shattering wars. Though as to why she wanted the Tarnished to get stronger and help her in killing a god in form of the Elden Beast remains ambiguous, as it is not only through different theories with which we could try to come to an answer, but the story of Marika's ascension to godhood and other fascinating aspects of her character will be revealed in Shadow of the Erdtree, as it is confirmed by Miyazaki himself in an IGN interview. But interestingly enough, in some contexts, a character striking a cross pose might also symbolize defiance against religious authority or societal norms. It could represent a rejection of organized religion or a challenge to established beliefs, which some authors frequently use to enhance their fictional creations. But I think way more interesting for our case is to take a look at the history of Christianity. For Marika being depicted in this pose not only has strong ties to this specific religion, but the way in which the Golden Order was fractured is not too unsimilar as to what happened in the 16th century in Europe, particularly in Germany. Martin Luther, or for you not fluent in German, Martin Luther, was a German monk and a theologian who sparked the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, a reformation that split Christianity into the Catholic and Protestant believers. Luther's reasons for challenging the Catholic Church focus largely on doctrinal disagreements, particularly over the practices and theology surrounding penance, indulgences, and the authority of the Church. Luther was vehemently opposed to the sale of indulgences, which were payments made to the Church that implied to reduce the punishment for sins in purgatory, a place every Christian would visit after death before he or she could ascend to the heavens. He argued that this practice undermined the seriousness of repentance and the concept of salvation by faith alone. Another big aspect of his defiance was his argumentation for sola scriptura, the idea that the Bible is the supreme authority in matters of faith and practice over and above church traditions or papal decrees. He believed that every Christian should have direct access to the scriptures, which led to his translation of the Bible from Latin into German, making it more accessible to the common people. I'm not trying to give you a complete historical rundown of Luther's history, but this massive rebellion and subsequent reformation of the Church is echoed in Elden Ring's lore, particularly when it comes to Marika, as we learn from this echo.
I declare mine intent to search the depths of the golden order through understanding of the proper way. Our faith, our grace is increased. Those blissful early days of blind belief are long past. My comrades, why must ye falter?
We know that Marika, much like Luther, didn't continue to blindly follow the greater will and his teachings, but sought to understand them further. What she has learned in her endeavors is another interesting realm for speculations, but in all likelihood led to her rebellion against the greater will and her wish of killing a god. Much like Luther, she must have seen massive flaws within the ways the greater will operates and began building her plans of usurping it as a direct result from what she has discovered, which next to the cross is yet another interesting parallel to Christianity. Just what did she discover about the greater will that so drastically pushed her to create such plans? To be honest, I haven't the slightest clue. Although this planned rebellion of her does coincide with the fact of Marika representing the concept of causality in Elden Ring's lore. Causality is a fundamental concept that refers to the relationship between causes and effects. It's the principle that everything has a cause and that cause leads to an effect, which in turn turns these effects into causes that spurn other effects. It is a process that continues for all eternity. As such, the Tarnished, Hughes' mission of creating a god-slaying weapon and ultimately Marika shattering the Elden Ring, which had the domino effect of the Tarnished returning to the lands between, is all closely connected to her discoveries regarding the greater will. Hence, the symbolic meaning of the cross being attributed to defiance and rebellion does align with Elden Ring's lore here. For it is unlikely that without Marika researching the greater will, she would have never found cause to lead a rebellion against the god she served through the Tarnished as her army. But the symbolism behind the cross holds also another special meaning, which is related to Marika's other half, Radagon. For the last symbolic meaning we can draw from the cross is its association with unity or harmony, as it can also symbolize the coming together of opposites. A character striking a cross pose might signify reconciliation, balance, or the resolution of conflicts, as it is argued by Leon Morris in his book The Cross in the New Testament. This is particularly relevant to Marika in multiple ways. Her existence alongside her male counterpart Radagon positions her as a unique entity that embodies both genders within a single being, demonstrating a physical unity with yet distinct psychological identities. Although they share one body, Marika and Radagon maintain separate personalities, which illustrates a complex duality of unity and individuality. Plus, at the same time, the symbolism behind the coming together of opposites is relevant to Radagon's character, who represents the other law making up the teachings of the Golden Order fundamentalism, the law of regression. As stated by its incantation, regression is the pole of meaning that all things yearn eternally to converge. This suggests that, rather than adhering to extreme ideologies that prioritize either intelligence and the studies of the stars as the sole means of finding life's meaning, or placing complete faith in the greater will and its faith-based incantations, the concept of regression aims to find a middle ground between these two contrasting perspectives, which Radagon represents perfectly. During his marriage to Renala and his time among the Carians, he delved into the study of sorceries. Later, through his union with Marika, he turned his focus to incantations. And because of his comprehensive understanding of these seemingly opposed disciplines, is ultimately what allowed him to found the concept of Golden Order fundamentalism, a school incorporating both intelligence and faith into their incantations, representing a synthesis of knowledge and belief. Radagon's marriage to Renala, which unified the House of the Moon and the Earth Tree, along with his establishment of fundamentalism that melds intelligence and faith, are, I believe, the key reasons why he is depicted in a cross-like pose in his statues. For through these actions, Radagon perfectly represents the unity and harmony behind the symbolism of the cross. Therefore, these 4 symbolic meanings associated with the cross and a depiction of a person in such a pose resonate deeply within the context of Elden Ring's lore. And maybe you are as surprised as me as to how big some parallels between the Golden Order and Christianity are. But before wrapping things up, there's one other instance of people on a cross we should take a look at. It is these people we find on crosses in Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula. There isn't anything about them in the entire lore of the game. However, there's something we can learn from the attire they wear. For the ones not burned, wear the guilty hood, which has the following line of lore. The garb of those accused of lesser crimes indicated by the collar of sharpened branches. Given that this hood is linked to individuals guilty of minor offenses who were then crucified, it's reasonable to assume that crucifixion is a well-established form of punishment within the Golden Order, as the Golden Order is the only power capable of persecuting and punishing criminals throughout the lands. But what is even more interesting is that explicitly for lesser crimes, they have been crucified. Crucifixion is a very painful death penalty, which I wouldn't assume to be dealt out for anything minor, especially when considering that Marika herself is eternally crucified within the Erdtree for committing the gravest possible sin, the shattering of the Elden Ring. For even in ancient Rome, crucifixion was primarily reserved for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state, especially for crimes such as treason, desertion from the army, rebellion, and certain types of theft. While the criteria for what constituted a crime severe enough for crucifixion could vary depending on the context and the ruling authority's discretion, it still was primarily used for crimes that were seen as severe threats to the public order or the authority of the state. If we can apply the same logic from ancient Rome onto the lore of Elden Ring, then I really wonder just what these guys have done to receive this kind of punishment. Yet, another detail we can learn from these unfortunate souls is that several of their bodies have been severely burned, leaving only their charred remains on the cross. However, the absence of burn marks on the crosses themselves indicates that these individuals were not burned while affixed to the cross, which I believe ties these crucified criminals to Messmer actually. For not only does it further cement Messmer's title as the Impaler, in regards to him potentially impaling Marika with a red lance on her cross in the Erdtree, like Longinus did to Jesus in the Bible, but the fact that we can find further crucifixion in an area which already has some ties to Messmer through the presence of the Impaler's catacombs would be yet another link between his character and the concept of crucifixion. Plus, if these crucifixions actually have been done by Messmer, who after all wields a flame with an association to death, it at the same time also explains why some bodies have been burnt, since the use of flame is explicitly prohibited for Erdtree followers, which could have been banned after his deed of betraying his mother Marika, which as of then and forevermore marked snakes and fire as traitors as well as enemies of Erdtree followers. For it is also interesting that the practice of crucifixion of criminals through the Golden Order is exclusive to this region of the Lands Between, and that also executed in the more imminent surroundings of Leyndell or the Altus Plateau. But I'm getting more into very wild speculations now with nothing to back them up. I better leave it at that and wait for what Messmer's lore will be in Shadow of the Erdtree. As a result, next to the use of crucifixion as a form of punishment for criminals of the Golden Order, it also holds very interesting symbolic meanings which are directly related to Elden Ring's lore. The fulfillment of a religious obligation as a consequence of Marika shattering the Elden Ring, it being a potential protective blessing, assuring the Tarnished that their grace will be restored and that they are resurrected from death later on, as well as representing Marika's rebellious actions against the Greater Will and the Elven Beast, whilst Radagon unifying and harmonizing different concepts of reality and life under the Golden Order. I hope it was as interesting of a topic for you as it was for me to research. So, consider to subscribe to stay tuned for more Elden Ring content. Plus, the results are in, and the next faction video will be about the ancient dragons and their culture, which will take a lot of time, but I've already begun to work on. In the meantime, you can watch my theory for Messmer's title or my visualization of the Mogren dynasty. At any rate, have a great day and see you next time. Ciao!